Hey everyone, welcome to the weekly Wrangle number 3. Hoping you're having a great Monday so far. My name is Tyler Bay with CG Forge, and today I want to talk about the engineer versus the artist. And I know if any of you have worked at a studio before, or just even at school or just any 3D project really, you'll know that there's a big difference between the folks who like to stay technical and the folks who like to stay more artistic. And so this isn't a battle of the two. It's more about understanding the similarities and the differences between, let's say, these two spectrums. And by doing so, I hope that maybe you can understand your coworkers better and perhaps some of the dynamics that go on within the productions that you're working with. So anyway, without further ado, let's check it out. So let's talk about the artist versus the engineer. And if any of you have ever worked at a studio before, you'll know that there's a huge spectrum of people that like to stay on the artistic side of things, and there are people who like to stay on the more technical engineer side of things. And this can become a huge source of friction and contention amongst people at studios. So it's really important that we understand where the artist comes from, as well as the engineer, how they're similar, how they're different. This will help you navigate many of the politics which go on in major studios. So let's take a look at our friend Alfredo, we saw him last time, and Eddie, the engineer. Eddie's new, he's got a bow tie, he's looking all spiffy, likes to code, likes to make tools and fun stuff like that. And really, both Alfredo and Eddie are very similar. And this is why I think this friction exists sometimes, because the differences between Alfredo the artist and Eddie are fairly subtle, but very important. So, the artist can sometimes act as an engineer, and an engineer can sometimes act as an artist, which makes this whole thing, again, kind of difficult to compare. So when I talk about Alfredo the artist, I'm talking about the extreme end of what a artist spectrum would be, when I talk about Eddie, I'm talking about the more technical engineer extreme. And so just realize that people are shades in between Alfredo and Eddie. And that, again, just kind of makes the whole thing a bit more complex. But as we'll find, you typically will either lean towards more of a artist, Alfredo side, or more of an Eddie side. So what makes them similar is that when coding or painting, as an example, there is a degree of subjectivity. And so this means that the engineer can, be a craftsman or an innovator. Their medium, coding, has multiple right and wrong answers. And so because of that, coding is an artistic medium. So this is where things get a little bit murky, because an engineer is still an artist. And to some degree, an artist also has to be an engineer because they have to use the tools which require some technicality to use. So again, this is where things feel a little bit wishy-washy, because your technical person does make 3D. They do, have subjective decisions, and arguably people who code every day are making more subjective decisions than the artist might. But once we take a look at their differences, you'll see that this is where things are significant. So the main difference between the artist and the engineer is that the artist's work is more about discovering the destination. The destination, let's say we have an artist who needs to make a painting. What that painting is going to be isn't always fully understood until it's made. And so the process that the artist goes through, the nature of their work, is much more about discovery. Whereas the engineer is more about having a specific goal ahead of time. We want to go to a specific target or a specific destination, and they're trying to figure out how to get from one end to the other. So as an example, let's say that a tool is broken and there's some sort of bug. Well, the destination in that case is to make a tool which works, and that destination doesn't change. Maybe the destination is to create a tool in Houdini that paints grass on the side of a cliff, right? That target doesn't move around. The way you execute the code, the way that you make that tool has subjectivity, but the destination itself doesn't usually change nearly as much. And so because of this, progress primarily means practice, more iterations, aligning with the world at large, and or feeling out the client's demands if you're an artist. And so for the artist, again, it's more about practice. It's more about how can I get more iterations to the client? How can I have more time to align with what the client is looking for? That means if you're a concept artist, you want to be having the time to send more iterations to the client, to align with what they want. Or if you're an artist and you're independent, if you're more of an innovator, you're trying to do that with the world at large instead. You're trying to figure out, you're trying to discover, and the way that you discover is by doing. It's about practice. It's about going through many iterations of something. That's how we refine what something ought to be. Now, for the engineer, this looks different. For the engineer, progress often means acquiring better knowledge and understanding of how a complex system works. So, as an example of that, an engineer can spend an entire day just tinkering around and, trying to figure out what this line of code does and, how this technical thing affects this other technical thing. And, if I can just get a little piece of information that I didn't know yesterday, that could mean progress for the engineer. And so, again, it's more about kind of tinkering around. It's more about trying to experiment with how complex systems work, how to figure out how to control complex systems. Ultimately, if you understand something that's really complex, like coding, then you're going to be better at figuring out how to get to a specific destination. So again, the goal for an artist in their work, that target that they're trying to hit, is going to change more often than it does for the engineer. And again, for the artist, they need to be more present. They need to be more in the moment as they work. And it's kind of like executing a performance. It's like kind of like imagining if you're playing a song on an instrument. You have to be in the moment. You have to be present. You can't really break that performance. And anything that breaks being present with your medium is going to reduce the quality and speed in which you create whatever it is that you're making. Whereas with Eddie the engineer, a day's work is more about tinkering around with abstract ideas. Again, we're trying to understand how this complex system works. And so with Eddie, it's more about having your heads in the clouds, so to speak, so that you can understand something complicated. Whereas with Alfredo, the artist, it's more about the speed and making sure that you're not being interrupted when you're spending a performance, when you're spending time with your medium. So what this means is that as you're doing your performance, and I'll call it a performance because really you're trying to apply what you already know how to do when a client is asking for money. You're not there to really experiment as much at this point. When you are performing with the medium, you want as little interruptions as possible. You want to take the guesswork out of it because those little moments where the computer crashes or something goes wrong or a bug happens, those are all moments which take away from more iterations, which makes it harder for you as an artist to do your job well. So what that means is that the artist wants simplicity and they want things to stay the same. They want things to be intuitive because if they're having to dig through user manuals and having to look up what this and that means and trying to understand the complicated bits and parts, if they're stuck doing that, then that's less time that they can practice. That's less time that they can use to become faster at the medium, give more iterations, and provide a better performance. Now let's say that the engineer just came up with a brand new tool. And the engineer says, hey, artist, you need to use this new tool because it's so much better. Okay? Even if the engineer is right and this tool is better, what the artist now has to do is rework the workflow, rework the pipeline that they've created for themselves. They have to go through the user docs. Maybe the user docs aren't explained very well. And if they have deadlines happening at the same time, then they're going to be stuck in this risky position where you have to both have all these iterations going as fast as usual while learning something new at the same time. And this is where artists have a difficult time picking up some of these technical things. They're caught trying to be fast and speedy while at the same time being under the expectation of experimenting and risking something new. So one reason why artists get really angry at engineers sometimes is because if an engineer doesn't make a substantial effort to make the parameters intuitive or to make things easily accessible, then it's almost like they're making the artist's life worse because even though that tool might be technically more proficient, it's impacting, again, the performance that they have to give, that they're expected to give under a studio situation. So that means engineers need to understand the artist's position. If you want to make tools that are going to be used, if you want to make tools that are going to be effective in practice, then that means you have to understand the political position that the artist is in. You have to make your tools in the way you label things really understandable. For most things, if you can't intuitively figure it out just by using the tool, then there probably is some opportunity to make that more accessible and easy to use for the artist who doesn't have time to tinker around like you do. So in this situation, the engineer can also misunderstand the artist by telling themselves, okay, well, I just invented the wheel, and this person's too lazy to not even open up a user doc. And they might be right. Artists do need to make a fair effort, I would say, to understand the engineer's tools and processes and to try to understand how 3D works in general. All of those things are important for the artist to do because it gives them options. But the engineer could be right in that, or they could be also misunderstanding the fact that the artist is under pressures that the engineer is not. Specifically, the pressure to iterate and to try to keep themselves aligned to a client's vision without being interrupted. And so, again, it takes that empathy from the engineer to the artist to understand their world if they want to make great tools. Now, in the engineer's defense, the artist needs to recognize how valuable a great tool can be, especially if you're working with a digital medium like 3D graphics, animation, anything that's computer-based specifically. If you have a better tool, you will get better results. Your workflow will improve. You will be able to iterate faster. You will be able to make better artwork. And I truly believe that. There's a lot of folks that say, well, all programs are the same. They're just a different kind of pencil. But I highly disagree with that analogy in something as complex as a software program. If somebody says that, this program over here crashes 50% of the time and is super slow and laggy and, has all these issues about it, right? And you have another program that doesn't do that. If you're saying that you take the same artist and they have a workflow over here for that slow program and they have another workflow over here for the fast program that doesn't crash, the fast program is going to make better art, make more iterations, make the artist happier, and ultimately make the client happier because the artist is doing a better job. So when it comes to something, again, like software, you can't make that analogy that they're just different pencils, because it's not a pencil, it's a piece of software. And the complexities and all the work that goes into the software that's designed by the engineer is ultimately something that will greatly benefit the artist if they align themselves with the tools and the processes that make them great at what they do. Now, you want to know my opinion about this whole situation. I think that in the world of 3D graphics and animation or any sort of computer software, the artist is nothing without the engineer. And the engineer also isn't anything without the artist. They need each other within a studio environment. They need to understand each other and work with each other so that the engineer can improve the habits, the practice that the artist goes through. And the artist needs to also be open-minded enough and not stubborn enough and brave even to explore the new workflows and possibilities and ways of learning something new so that they can create more interesting art or so that they can have more options as they use their medium. All right. So that's the main spiel that I have with artists and engineers. Now, obviously, this topic is huge, and we can talk all about the different political situations and all the different ways that artists gain power within a studio or ways that engineers do so. There's all kinds of interesting intricacies to the artist and the engineer that go beyond just their personal disposition. But if this is a topic that you've never thought about before, then I really think it'll benefit you, not just in working nicely with other people, but just understanding some of the dynamics at play at a studio. So with that being said, takeaway number 1, understand the other person. I think that if the engineer thinks about the position that the artist is in, they're going to make better tools. They're going to understand the predicament that artists have by needing to make all kinds of fast iterations and deliver to a client. And, it's kind of like if you're an artist, you might get feedback that's like, well, it's good, but it needs to be more fluffy, right? Like artists have to deal with stuff like that. more so than the engineer does. And so just realize that other people that are in different roles have different problems than you. And that is as well true with the artist looking at the engineer. Recognize all the great lengths that an engineer has to go to make software and how difficult that is. There's a lot of research. There's a lot of discipline and tinkering around. There's a lot of skill that goes into what they do as well. And so you have to make a fair effort to explore the tools, to take risks and go outside your comfort zone if you want to have an edge as an artist working within a 3D animation studio. So that's takeaway number one. Takeaway number two, and this is especially true if you're a student or you haven't really found your niche yet in the industry, that is to understand yourself. Like I was saying earlier, one of the biggest differences between the engineer and the artist is that the destination is either more fixed for the engineer or it's more likely to move around for the artist. So, some people, they get more stressed out when the target is moving around, when the client comes back to you and says, well, I love this, but it needs to be extra fluffy, right? Some people get really stressed by just some of the ambiguity that the artist has to tap into all the time. And then other people are more stressed out if the target is too rigid and too still. There's that, lack of flexibility. They can't really improvise, and they like improvising. They can't really move things around as much. The target, again, is fixed. For some folks, that stresses them out more. So understand yourself. If you're picking a direction with your career, then it's really important to understand the differences between artists and engineers. So that does it for today. I don't have any chat comments, but if you're tuning in, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.